Meet your ovaries, tiny walnut-sized powerhouses quietly running the show. Brain, bones, heart, skin, they're in constant conversation with almost every part of your body, and most of us have no idea. I sat down with Dr. Jennifer Garrison, a neuroscientist who's basically the Sherlock Holmes of reproductive longevity, to talk about the organ half the population carries and science has spent decades ignoring. We dug into how ovaries function more like biochemical conductors than egg dispensers, how women's health got left out of the data revolution, and what everyone needs to know about hormones, aging, and staying well for the long haul. This isn't just women's stuff. It's the missing chapter in the longevity story. Let's dive in. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining us today. I am really excited actually for this conversation because there is so many areas of your work that is just, for me, just feels so groundbreaking and so needed. So first of all, I want to thank you for sitting down with me today.
Thank you for asking me questions.
Could we start maybe in me asking you, like what I would love to get out of this conversation to communicate is why the ovaries are important. What should every woman know about the ovaries? And maybe how does that affect us at the different stages of our life?
Sure. Well, usually when we say ovary, people automatically think fertility, menopause. And maybe they might think periods, menstruation. But I think it's really important to understand that ovaries are more than just for baby making. They're not just egg factories. They are actually important for health throughout a woman's life. They are sitting at the center of a really complex signaling network. And so I think about them kind of like conductors of a symphony. They're having really complicated chemical conversations with almost every tissue in a female body. So they talk to your brain, they talk to your heart, they talk to your bones, they talk to your skin, they talk to your muscles, and I could go on and on. And they're engaged in this dynamic two-way chemical conversation with almost every one of your tissues. And while we don't understand very much about those individual conversations, we're still really far behind in terms of the research, in terms of understanding what's happening. But what we do know is what happens when either they're not working properly or when you take them away. And so what we can say is that ovaries are important for health, for maintaining health at every age. So they're not just important in your 30s when you might want to have a child, and they're not just important at and after menopause, when they change how they're functioning. 1 in 3 women have conditions that are linked to poor ovarian function. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. So I call them the architects of health in female bodies. I think that that's maybe encapsulates what I want people to understand about them. But they're also, you could also think about them as like a pacemaker for aging, meaning that if you consider organ function over time, your organs aren't aging at exactly the same rate. It's a little asynchronous. But if you're lucky enough to live to older ages, then most of the decline that's happening across your organ systems during normal aging happens in those last few decades of life, right? But for ovaries, they age a lot faster, functionally speaking, like at least 2.5 times the rate of the rest of the tissues in the female body. And because they're so important for maintaining health, that early aging, that accelerated aging in ovaries essentially sets up a really profound dichotomy between how females age and how males age. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So pacemaker for aging is one way to think about them.
It's incredible because it's really bringing the thought of ovaries into this longevity, lifespan, health span conversation. I've seen in some of your talks where you've spoken about how women, yes, their lifespan may be longer, but their health span is shorter. So this meaning that as women, we are living longer in poor health.
That's right.
than men. So this conversation is so important. So anything that that you can share about ovarian health in terms of what we can do at each stage. So if I started with somebody, say, pre-puberty. So if there's a girl watching here and she's thinking, oh, what should I know about my ovaries? What maybe can I do now to...
We really are pretty far behind in terms of understanding ovarian function. Just in terms of female bodies in general, the research has really lagged behind. And so while we're seeing an increase in both preclinical and clinical research around women's health, we're still in the dark ages. And so I hope that, someday soon we'll have really concrete information about how ovaries function at every age, at baseline, so that we can provide actionable insights to women at every age. And, I'm not talking about some silver bullet miracle drug that's just going to extend your ovarian function for your whole life. Rather, we should be able to talk to a prepubescent girl and give her, a list of things that they might be drugs, but they might also be lifestyle interventions. They might be devices. Who knows? We don't even know what we don't know. But that whatever list of things we give them, that, if they do these things, it'll, bias them towards hopefully having an extended ovarian function, that those will be different from the things that you would give to someone who was in their 20s or 30s or 40s. But for young women especially, this is such an important message, because you and I never had, at any moment in our adult lives, someone, a doctor, someone at university level, anyone who was there to talk about our health, never had anyone pull us aside and say, hey, here's what you can expect to have happen in your 20s, in your 30s, in your 40s, in your 50s, with respect to your whole body physiology. And I hope you probably had in the UK. In the US, we have sex ed somewhere in, the 10 to 12 years old range, where we learn about how not to get pregnant. And we learn a little bit about, the changes happening in our bodies, and maybe we learn about menstruation. But at no point in my life did someone pull me aside and say, oh, by the way, you're going to need to think about, if you want to have biological children, you'll need to think about fertility in your 20s. If you want to, be functional at work in your 40s, you're going to have to think a lot about perimenopause. I didn't even know what that word meant. So the idea would be that once we have that knowledge, there will be hopefully lots of ways for us to prolong or extend ovarian function so that we can maintain our health span. I'm not talking about preserving fertility forever. I think a lot of people, when they hear me say preserve ovarian function, they think what I'm talking about is, enabling women who are 90 to have babies. And that's just really not what we're talking about. It really comes down to maintaining health and preserving health, and really matching up aging in ovaries with aging in the rest of the body.
I think I read that you had some research where putting ovaries from a young...
Not me.
Was this not you?
No,
so maybe,
gosh,
could you maybe
not
talk
me.
a bit about this research? Because I think maybe this helps inform what why
Absolutely. So why do we think that ovaries have this important role in health, right? I just told you that we don't understand how they work. So there seems to be a disconnect there. There's a lot of data that we have, both from animal studies and also from humans, that really, point to ovaries playing this important role. So there's a beautiful set of experiments that were not done by me, where they took old mice and they swapped in young ovaries, and they did the converse experiment too. Old ovaries into young mice, bad things happened. But when you take young ovaries and you transplant them into older mice, it not only extends their lifespan, so it makes them live longer, but it also extended their health span. So that was really, that tells you something about what ovaries are doing. Again, we don't understand the details, but that tells you that they're important. Then the more interesting thing they did was they took those young ovaries and they removed all the follicles, so no eggs. And then they did the same experiment. So young ovaries that didn't have eggs, transplanted into old mice, same result, still extended health span and lifespan, but it extended their lifespan even further. So that tells you that the fertility function of ovaries at least is partially separable from this health span extending function. And that makes a little bit of sense because what I talked about earlier with ovaries being, the center of this complex signaling network, that's not necessarily related to fertility and baby making. So again, we don't really understand all the details. We're still pretty far behind in the research, but that's hopefully taking off now. The other really interesting sets of data that I think, for me, tell me that we have a lot to discover come from humans. So a lot of fertility treatments, the assisted reproductive technology field, IVF, that actually grew out of the desire to preserve fertility for women who are undergoing cancer treatment, right? So if you're female, if you're of childbearing age, and you're having either chemotherapy or radiation, that generally speaking will kill all of the follicles in your ovaries, right? So it really handicaps your ability to have biological children after you survive cancer treatment. And so IVF grew out of the need to preserve fertility, future fertility for women who are undergoing cancer treatment. And so the question arises, what do you do for a girl who's too young to have her eggs frozen, right? So a girl who's not gone through puberty yet, there aren't any eggs to freeze. But if that girl needs to have chemotherapy or radiation treatment, how do you preserve her future fertility in case she wants to have biological children after she survives cancer? And so I'm not sure what led someone to do this experiment, but what they did is they said, okay, well, there's no eggs to freeze, so why don't we just freeze some of the ovarian tissue itself? So they literally just froze pieces of ovarian tissue, and then decades later, put it back. And so not a whole ovary, just put back a piece of ovarian tissue. And in some cases, so this is not a very efficient experiment. It doesn't work very well. But in some cases, that was enough to restart the conversation between brain and ovaries, such that menstrual cycles restarted. And in some cases, that was enough to actually lead to the birth of a live baby. And how that works, we have no idea. And I think it's important to emphasize that this is not going to be a universal solution, right? It's not a solution to ask a young woman who's healthy to have an invasive surgery that has a lot of risks associated with it, preserve a piece of tissue frozen for decades, which has a lot of cost associated with it, and then have another invasive surgery that comes with all kinds of risks. And then to have that surgery over and over again, year by year, because it doesn't last forever. So that's not a solution. But what it tells me as a scientist is that there are signals that are coming from that ovarian tissue that are really fundamental and important for that conversation between brain and ovaries that's important for health. And so that's kind of where my research landed, is trying to figure out what those signals are. But all of this together tells me that ovaries are, they have more function than just baby making.
I was going to ask you how you got interested in this area, but as you're speaking, I can understand this is a minefield to uncover, but also the potential is potentially the key. It could be a key to unlock here too.
Oh, there's so much to discover. I mean, women's health is just a giant black box, and thinking about female bodies and how little we know about just the most basic things about how female bodies work. It's a huge open, there's so many questions to ask. It's a huge open, just not a minefield. It's like a treasure trove of potential discoveries. But that also means that, we're in a situation where we don't have a lot of solutions and we don't have a lot of answers for women. And it can be quite frustrating.
Yeah. And I think obviously where there's a vacuum, it gets filled a lot by a lot of information.
Sometimes misinformation.
Misinformation and everything coming up. For example, I had no idea that IVF had come out of cancer treatment for precipitation.
Yeah, oncofertility is what they call it, right? So that was where the idea grew out of, was how do you preserve fertility for women who survive cancer treatment?
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah.
So women who are in their 30s, maybe this is the first time that they're thinking about fertility because maybe they're trying to get pregnant. And I feel like we've been sold a lot around, you can do IVF, you can do this. Could I ask you, from what you've learned, what would be your sort of advice, or what was your knowledge around, say, IVF, egg freezing, maybe some risks or things that we don't think about, as well as, potential?
Yeah, sure. I think it's important to point out that I'm a PhD scientist, not a doctor. And so, not a medical doctor. So I can't give medical advice. I can just tell you about the data. So for me, I think the fact that we have assisted reproductive technologies, I think it's amazing. For some women who want to have biological children, this is literally the only option available to them. And so it's kind of fantastical that it exists. Having said that, I'm 49 right now, and I think I'm just about the same age as the first IVF baby. I might be slightly older, but we've had this technology for 45 plus years. And in that time, it hasn't changed a lot. There hasn't been a huge amount of innovation. And you could argue lots of different reasons why that might be. But one, I think, is that it's a for-profit industry that is driven to maintain itself as an industry. In a perfect world, if I could have anything I wanted, I would want to make the discoveries or have the discoveries out there in the world that would make IVF obsolete, right? Like ideally, if you could preserve ovarian function and match up aging in ovaries with aging in the rest of the body, I think that would mean that a lot of the issues that cause infertility would also be resolved. So, of course, that's a pie in the sky, crazy blue sky idea. But for me, the assisted reproductive technology industry is just really fraught with a lot of conflicts of interest, right? If you're an IVF clinic and you are trying to make a profit, then that means that, you're competing with other IVF clinics for patients, and your statistics, what your rate of pregnancy is, how many eggs you get on every retrieval, all of those statistics are really important for your bottom line. And so I know women who have been turned away from IVF clinics because of their age or some genetic risk factor or something that makes them less likely to get pregnant because they might ruin the statistics, right? Of course, there are also academic centers that do IVF and don't have those kinds of pressures. But, in the US, it's very expensive to go through a round of IVF. And the chances of success vary, obviously, between different sites, but they're generally really low. And I feel like most women don't fully understand both all of the risks that are associated with the procedure, and they also don't really understand what the chances of success are. And I think if they were clearly explained, there might be, I feel like the best thing that you can have when there's not a perfect solution available is information. And that then you can make an educated decision and you can take into account all of the things that are important to you. It might be that you're willing to risk all kinds of things to have a biological child, and that is perfectly fine. But I think a lot of people go into IVF and egg freezing without really understanding the risks and also the chances of success. So for me, that's problematic. Ovaries they're so dynamic and they're so beautifully complex, much like the brain, actually. I oftentimes I call the brain like the most complex object in the known universe. That's debatable, but I think it's probably true. The human brain. Ovaries are not quite that complicated, but compared to other organs in your body, they're so dynamic. If you think about what happens across the course of a cycle, right? And I'm not going to say 28 days because the 28-day cycle is a myth. I think it's something like 12% of menstrual cycles are 28 days long. So it varies quite a lot by an individual. But across a cycle, if you think about what's happening in your ovaries, there's this dynamic macroscopic remodeling that happens, like physical remodeling. And then there's also everything that's happening at the microscopic level. It's bananas how much your ovaries change across a cycle. But then they also change on different time scales across a year, across many years. Anyway, you are born, your fetal ovaries around 26 weeks gestation are formed, and all of the primordial follicles that are ever going to be there are there.
I just wonder, given what you've learned, what you know, what your advice and not as a medical doctor, but would be to women who are maybe even in their 20s.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. For younger women, I think, again, knowledge is power. I think that the message should be that girls, right, young girls, women in their 20s should learn as much as they can about their own bodies. I feel like knowledge is power. And while we don't have a lot of knowledge, you can actually, as much as possible, understand your own body. So female physiology is beautifully complex. And, individuals are incredibly different, right? Cycle length is just one metric that we can talk about that's very different between individuals. But as a young woman, I try to encourage people to really pay attention to their bodies, to their cycles, to find out, how at different stages of their cycles, not just how they're feeling, but how it impacts their ability to focus, their ability to think, all of these things. There's beautiful studies too that have been done to show, that in terms of physical capabilities, physical performance, exercise, sport, all of that at different parts of your cycle, you have different ability levels. And this is all knowable, right? This is all knowable. And I think I like to say, girls should think about their menstrual cycle as their superpower, not as something that they have to worry about or dread or be ashamed of. Rather, if you really understand what's happening in your body, you can take advantage of that knowledge and leverage it, right? And there are now more and more, I see even companies, but there's just more and more studies coming out that are providing that kind of data. So I think understanding your own body and paying attention to it and really learning to leverage that as your superpower, I think is one piece of advice. The other piece of advice I would say is to really understand what is going to happen in your later 20s and 30s, which is that for many women, and they don't understand this until they go to try to use, most women only find out there's a problem when they go to try to use their ovaries, right? When they want to have a child.
Yeah, what are these?
Right, exactly. Yeah. And oftentimes it's too late because as it turns out, ovaries are aging so much faster than the rest of the tissues in your body. When you're in your late 20s, early 30s, the medical community already considers your ovaries geriatric, right? And so a lot of women don't understand that they could potentially lose their fertility much sooner than they're led to believe by pop culture, right?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point that to take home for anybody in there.
But the other thing I would say is that for younger women, ovarian function, again, we don't understand all the details and we don't understand exactly what the relationships are, but it's very clear that ovarian function is is intricately linked to metabolic function and immune function across the lifespan. So in younger women who have, for example, polycystic ovarian syndrome, PCOS, which impacts more than 10% of women, and most women don't even realize they have it. But women who have PCOS, when they're younger, are much more likely to have metabolic disease later in life. And that's a really strong link. Again, we don't understand how that works, but knowing that, if you're a woman in your 20s and you have PCOS, knowing that you might be predisposed to metabolic dysfunction or disease later in life might really, help you rethink what you're doing in this moment to kind of bias you towards better outcomes later. And that's really what preventative health is about, is like understanding what's happening now, how it might relate to what could happen later, and then changing your behaviors, changing, how you're approaching your health in the moment, right? And again, knowledge is power.
Yeah, I love that. I think wherever we can be proactive about our health, the better. What I think is so interesting with your work is where you have linked the ovaries with longevity in terms of how I want to say this correctly because it's not necessarily causation, but more correlation, that you've spoken about the age of menopause being linked to longevity and even affecting brothers. So could you just explain a bit of
this is not my work, work. So most of what I'm talking about is not my own lab's work. I'm talking about the work of dozens, hundreds of other people all over the world. There are now many beautiful studies looking at the genetics around age at natural menopause, right? And those are fairly recent studies. Actually, many of them came out of the UK. But age at natural menopause is a complex trait, and it's not just one gene, it's a multigenic trait. And you can't explain age and natural menopause entirely using genetics. So environment and other things come into play as well. But what is clear is that there is a correlation, and again, don't know what's cause and what's effect, but there's a correlation between the age at which a woman goes through menopause naturally and overall lifespan. And so it's really important to emphasize that that does not mean at the level of the individual that if you go through menopause early, you're going to die young. But on a statistical average level, so on a population level, if a woman, if basically older age at menopause tends to correlate with longer lifespan. And using some really actually old data, someone made the link that women who go through menopause later tend to live longer, but so do their male brothers, which means that, there are through lines that, cross sexes, meaning there's some genetic components that are related to age at natural menopause, which might also play an important role in longevity. Those genes might play an important role in longevity in men as well. But again, we don't know the identity of those genes. We don't know, we're still far from understanding how all of this works. Yeah. But it's, tantalizing and interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So how important do you think the kind of mind-body connection is in this area?
Well, I'm biased. This is my area of neuroscience. We spend a lot of time thinking about how the brain communicates with the rest of the body and how it integrates feedback and how that really sets up and maintains your physiology. So your brain is like, if you think about your body like a busy city, I use this analogy a lot. If you think about your body like a busy city, then your brain is command central. And it's, constantly giving out orders and basically listening to and integrating feedback as well to make those decisions. And what it's doing is it's setting and maintaining your physiology so that you can stay alive. That's what your brain does. It's a master. I would call it a master regulator. But it's not ruling like a dictator. It does have this kind of two-way conversation, and some of that conversation is hardwired, right? Just like fiber optic cables connect, different places. your nerves are physical connections between your brain and other organs, and they're carrying electrical signals in both directions. And that's hardwired signaling. What we study is your brain also has a wireless communication network, just like Wi-Fi in your house. Your brain can send and receive signals that are not physically connected. And so, yeah, that's what we study is the brain's Wi-Fi. And that Wi-Fi is mediated by chemicals that travel back and forth between your brain and the rest of the body, and they carry messages. And those messages are really diverse. They could be small molecules, they could be lipids, they could be peptides, they could be proteins. There's lots of different ways that your body communicates, but it really is this kind of Wi-Fi signaling. And that Wi-Fi signaling tends to control things that happen on longer timescales. So, the signaling that happens in your nerves, that wired signaling, is very fast, like millisecond timescale. It gets turned off quickly. It's very fast. On the timescale of the Wi-Fi signaling, it's often much slower, at least on the timescale of your nervous system, milliseconds, seconds, minutes, hours, days. And it mediates things like behavior. And it sets up homeostatic systems that, have set points that have, defend against change so that you can, again, maintain life. So I think it's, quite frankly, more interesting than the wired signaling, but I'm totally biased.
But it is fascinating. We've all experienced bad Wi-Fi, so so is that maybe a very simplistic way to think about it? But when there starts to be these problems, whether it's specifically neurodegenerative or brain problems, or perhaps ovarian problems, or is this to do with these signals?
Could be. This is an area that has really been underexplored because if you think about it, with a wired signal, much like an electrical circuit, you can go in and you can measure things at specific points and they're connected. And so you can really understand what's happening in that system. But if you're talking about a signal that travels over long distances and on long time scales, like how do you even measure that? So I would say that studying that brain's Wi-Fi system has really lagged behind what we understand about synaptic signaling or wired signaling, simply because the tools weren't available. So in the last decade and a half, there's been a lot of real progress in developing tools to study these systems. So, we're catching up, but I think that we're still pretty far behind understanding how it works. It's also more complicated in a sense because you don't just have the signal itself, right, which is traveling from brain to somewhere else or somewhere else to brain. You also have the receptor that senses that signal in the target tissues, right? So if we're talking about a brain-ovary axis of signaling, it might be a hormone or a peptide or something that's made in your brain that signals to ovaries. But the hormone by itself doesn't do anything unless there's a receptor in your ovaries to sense it. And then there's many layers of regulation on top of all of that I won't even get into. And so there's all these nodes of regulation in these systems, and it just makes it really complicated. It's complex to understand, and but really fun.
I don't know, for some reason, I'm thinking of that board game, I don't know if you had in the States, Operation.
Oh, yes.
You sweat in a thing and somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly.
Up.
Yes, that's right.
So you mentioned on those signals around, was it like a number of peptides being one of them? And I think maybe a lot of people who are not scientists like myself might not have been so familiar with those. But I think with the rise, particularly in the last year, first of all, of hearing the brand names like Ozempic and Mounjaro, and then GLP-1s, I think, has kind of come into the mainstream now that people have heard of GLP-1s and they think of, so obviously that has the word peptide in there. So the first first kind of introduction to that. Is that kind of how that's working in a way?
Yeah. So endogenous bioactive peptides, of which GLP-1 is one, there are literally hundreds of them in the human body. And they do work. Those are one of many classes of signaling molecules that do mediate this kind of Wi-Fi communication. Sometimes they signal locally, like to cells nearby, but oftentimes they can signal over longer distances. And so that's one way that your brain does Wi-Fi signaling. And GLP-1 is a neuropeptide. We call them neuropeptides because they were discovered in the nervous system, but it's really a misnomer, and that's why I'm calling, because they can be made and sensed by non-neuronal tissue. So that's why I call them bioactive peptides instead of neuropeptides, but those terms are kind of interchangeable. But GLP-1 is a neuropeptide, and you've probably heard of other neuropeptides. Oxytocin is one, vasopressin is one, and orexin is one. And these are what's beautiful about these neuropeptides is that they're mediating not just the physiology, but also the associated behaviors. So, so if you think about, if you think about feeding behavior, it's also impacting energy homeostasis. So the physiology and the behavior, they're just really cool.
That's incredible. So similarly, maybe with temperature or how you're perceiving.
Yeah, body temperature regulation. There's lots of neuropeptides involved in that. Not exclusively, right? Your brain's complicated, and so there's a lot of different things happening all at the same time. But yeah, GLP-1 is a neuropeptide, and it, just like what I described a minute ago, it has receptors. It has other regulatory nodes that mediated signaling. But these drugs that people are using that are GLP-1 mimics, essentially, are very different. We don't fully understand how they're working, but they're doing some things that are very different from what the endogenous peptide in your body does.
But given that they have gone through testing and they are on the market, I think because the word GLP-1 has become more known with the general public, I now actually was looking earlier on Google, just put in GLP-1 and maybe 50 supplements came up, GLP-1 mimicking. Yeah. Maybe you can help debunk some of these myths. I've written some words and GLP-1 supplements. If somebody is selling a supplement saying they can naturally, mimic that, what do you think when you hear that?
This is not my area of expertise, but what I can, I'm not an expert on these weight loss drugs, but what I can say is that the levels of GLP-1 that you have endogenously in your body are whatever they are. And if someone's trying to sell you something and to tell you that they can increase those endogenous levels, twofold or threefold or whatever, that is not relevant, because the drugs that you're talking about, Ozempic, Mounjaro, Zepbound, whatever they call, Wegovy, same drugs, different indications. The levels that those drugs are mimicking in your body are like thousands of times higher than what you normally have in your body. So there's no supplement that's going to mimic that, that's going to turn up the levels of GLP-1 that you're making to achieve that in your body. So I don't know what the supplements are. I don't know. They may well be able to increase your GLP-1 levels a little bit, but that's not going to do the same thing that these drugs are doing. So I think I would say it's a marketing ploy, and unfortunately it's challenging to fight that kind of misinformation, because it requires that you understand all these things about how GLP-1 works in your own body. And it's challenging.
And thank you for explaining that, because that's, as a consumer, it's really confusing. You don't really know. Okay, so something else, on the sort of supplements side. Can I ask you any thoughts on supplements? Because when we know we have problems and we don't know what to do, and then of course we can just walk into our local shop and buy whatever supplements we want. And I feel like a lot of people think because something's natural that it's harmless. So
natural is a marketing term. We see this pop up too in hormone therapy for women. Natural is a meaningless term. And it's made like it's a marketing term to engender some sort of level of trust in you that if it comes from nature, it must be good or positive. And that's just nonsense. So if you see the word natural, just ignore it. I think for me personally, I think supplements are problematic for many reasons. One is that they're not regulated. And so there's no standards for testing. There's no standards for actually proving that the ingredients you say are there in the amounts that you say they're there. And so it's kind of a minefield of misinformation, questionable products. And that doesn't mean that there aren't supplements out there that are really high quality and that are what they say they are. But the question of whether or not you need to take a supplement is one that you should address with a doctor, because I think if you're deficient in something, you absolutely should supplement it. That's the whole beauty of modern medicine and science, is that we have figured out how to, at least in some cases, top up levels of certain endogenous things that you need in your body, and that's great. But I think people view supplements as some sort of a shortcut to health. And in most cases, the idea that it's either going to have a positive effect or a neutral effect, but people don't recognize that it could also have like a net negative effect, whether that's because there's toxic heavy metal contamination that you don't think about or that you don't really discover, or that you're really taxing your liver and maybe even your kidneys by ingesting way higher doses of something than your body could actually use, right? So if you take, 20 times more of something than your body can absorb, then most of it is just getting either excreted or metabolized and excreted. And so that's putting a lot of pressure on your liver and your kidney to do that. But then there's also just like supplements, generally speaking, have a lot of fillers and inert ingredients in them that, again, have to be, like, your body has to get rid of them. And so I think most people don't really think carefully about what they're doing when they're taking a supplement. So my personal view is that supplement if you have a deficiency, certainly. But the idea that you can improve your health by taking a lot of supplements is probably pretty flawed. And you might want to take a closer look at what you're taking, what's in it, and whether or not you really need it.
Thank you so much for that. I feel like another area that is tricky to navigate is on the sort of aesthetic side, where I hear a lot of words like NAD+. I see it on the supplement side too, but now in creams and peptides, all these words that I'm hearing. Given your knowledge as a scientist, and I believe you were a chemist, you trained as a chemist as well. Is it? Maybe you could explain what NAD, just to take that one as an example, NAD plus, what that is, and is there any effect of having that on a cream, for example?
Oh my God. I would encourage anyone listening to this to go and Google. If you Google NAD, you'll come up with, tens of thousands of links, and you'll come up with hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people trying to sell you things, all the way from, as you said, supplements through to creams and potions. And it's really, I would say, a great example of why science is important, but it's also a cautionary tale for understanding that misinformation can sometimes drown out the real message and the real science. And I will say, as scientists, we're terrible at communicating. We're really bad at distilling messages down to something that people can understand and actually, giving that information to the public. But there's been some really quite animated and thorough debates about this out there, and I would encourage you to look at those. But NAD is something that your body needs. It's a cofactor that every cell in your body needs. And it's a cofactor that is used to, I don't want to get too complicated here, but it can exist in multiple different forms. So it's something that can go through oxidation and reduction, and that process of adding and removing electrons, essentially, is what makes it important as a cofactor. So it helps enzymes work better. It does a lot of things in your body. Every cell needs it. But that, just like what I was talking about with the peptides and the receptors and the regulatory enzymes, that same thing with the redox chemistry around NAD in your cells. And so the idea that you can ingest some form of NAD and that it's going to magically be utilized or be taken up and utilized in the form that your cells might need is just, it's so divorced from reality, the biological reality, that I think it's funny, but it's actually really sad because people are being sold these things at quite high prices, I must say. And there's I think the science is still catching up, and I would be really cautious about giving money away to anyone who's telling you that they can change NAD levels in your cells based on a cream or a pill or a gel or suppository or whatever it is they're trying to sell you.
Thank you.
Having said that, though, I will say that, the science of skin and aging, I think it's one of those areas that's really, it's received a lot of attention. And there are some really great studies around, what's happening in skin during aging. And so there's a lot of credible data out there to support different products, right? And I don't want to name any of them because that's not my role here, but there's a lot of science that's been done in the last decade to show how skin changes during aging, what kinds of things you might be able to apply, and whenever you're talking about skin, you have to think hard about, if I put something on topically, even if it's the right component based on the science, will it actually get down to the parts of your skin that need it? That's number one. And number two, is there credible data to support whatever it is I'm doing? And for some skincare products, there really is. So for example, for women during aging, a lot of the visible signs of aging in our skin can be traced back to changes in estradiol, estrogen signaling. And so, there are studies out there to show that supplementing forms of estrogen in face creams can actually have an effect. So, there's great science out there. And there are, I would say, lots of companies that are actively pursuing real science-backed solutions. But always look at the data. I think you have to divorce, this is true for everything in science and medicine. If someone's trying to sell you something and they're also telling you that they did the study to support it, you might just take a step back and, look for an alternative study, an outside voice, something like that. Just, a little red flag kind of situation.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we will have to become little scientists, I think, ourselves. So thank you for explaining the NAD+, because I think talking to some friends who have been going through menopause, this seems to be, maybe it's been very targeted towards that group of women. So in terms of then menopause, that side, before I was chatting to you, I was talking to a few friends who were like, oh, she's a neuroscientist. Oh, I wonder, would she recommend HRT or MHT? I guess that's the correct term is MHT, but still seems to be in the lingo a lot, HRT, for people to understand, but hormone therapy. If you have no symptoms, so if you are one of those lucky people who is, advancing in life and you actually have no symptoms, as women, what would be your recommendation? Is it getting the information? So
I think understanding I think information again is power. And again, I don't give medical advice, but I think there's been a lot of misinformation around hormone therapy. A lot of it derives from the first study that was published using the Women's Health Initiative data set. And people get very confused because there was this one study that was published in 2002, and it was really the first comprehensive data set published around this Women's Health Initiative study. And it's important to understand that the Women's Health Initiative was a multi-decade longitudinal data set collection. And there have been thousands of papers, thousands of studies published using that data set. But that very first paper that was published, it was really amplified by the popular press. The study, the way they set it up was flawed. The data itself wasn't statistically significant. And yet the messages that were amplified from that study really dramatically impacted how we approach hormone therapy for women across an entire, a whole generation of women essentially suffered unnecessarily because they were pulled off of hormone therapy. Doctors stopped prescribing it. You can read all about it. But since then, it's really important to emphasize that many things, actually. I think that the conversation that we're having now should be turned around. The question shouldn't be, should I take hormone therapy between individuals?
Did I hear you say that there's over 135?
Yes, and there's of course there's stratification of which symptoms are most common, and it depends on, again, who you are as an individual. But there's a lot of different symptoms of perimenopause, because if you buy what I told you earlier about ovaries sitting at the center of this complex signaling network that we don't understand, if your ovaries really are talking to almost every tissue in your body, they're not just using estrogen and progesterone to do that. They're probably making and utilizing lots of other signaling molecules that we don't yet know or understand. And so, when ovarian function changes, it's important to say it's not that ovaries stop working, because we know they're still doing something after menopause. It's just very different from what they were doing before. And we also know that it's not just some very steady decline that you see in that graph. That's an average, right? At the level of the individual, it's going like this. If you're just looking at even estrogen or progesterone, it goes up and down. It's fluctuating during perimenopause. And so if you imagine that symphony that I was talking about, this biochemical symphony that ovaries are involved in. If you imagine that there's lots of different things that are changing in different directions at different times, and probably differently in different people, that kind of helps to explain why the symptoms of perimenopause are so variable and so different between individuals. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for explaining that, because from my own conversations with women, especially going through menopause, I think, or perimenopause as well, what you said about changing the narrative, the question to the risks of not taking hormone replacement therapy as that framing question is so important.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of women are scared of breast cancer. And, depending on who you are as an individual, that might be something that you want to make sure that you talk about with your doctor. But osteoporotic fractures, which, if you are past a certain age and you break a bone, your risk of death in the next year skyrockets. right? So your risk of death is quite high if you break a bone past a certain age. And so, the number of osteoporotic fractures every year is the same as the number of women who get breast cancer every year. Your risk of cardiovascular disease goes up so much at and after menopause. There's just so many things that we know hormone therapy can protect against, that it's worth a conversation. And, there's a confounding factor here, which is that most medical professionals didn't receive any training about female bodies at all during their medical training, but they also really didn't get any information about how to take care of women at and after midlife. And so if your doctor didn't get that training, then it might be challenging to have these conversations. So I always encourage people that I know to, if your doctor doesn't understand what you're saying, go find another doctor. There's just, it's unfortunate that we have to be our own advocates at this stage, but that's kind of where we are.
I've even had conversations recently with doctors who are I feel like clearly they want to know more too. And when I was listening to some of your talks about that lack of research, it really brought it full circle to me, because I can see how yes, also sometimes your doctor may want to help you, but they don't actually have data to inform something there.
Yeah, it's a vicious circle.
Yeah.
I mean, it's getting better where, it's a positive message. Yeah. Sent out a positive message.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I wanted to ask you, I had a sentence written here, which I said, I'd like to ask you that in 2040, if I could ask you to finish this sentence, if everything went as you would hope and that we have success in raising more funding for women's health and learning more about the ovaries, the ovary-brain axis, that for you, that in 2040, every 40-year-old woman will. Like, what would be that for you, that every woman at 40 will? Would there be a moonshot there for you?
Every woman at 40 will. Every woman at 40 will have agency over how and when she decides to have a child. And every woman at 40 will have the promise of extended health span. Like, every woman should have, by then, if everything went perfectly, we should all have our health span matched up with our lifespan, right? That would be the goal. We get there by having women in positions of power and leadership across the board, not just in science and medicine, but everywhere. If we had women reflected, if the number of women in power positions and leadership positions matched the population.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. I think we would get there.
I think we would. Listen, thank you so much, Jennifer, for sitting down and chatting with us. And I hope this is just the first of many conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.